What's up guys? Before we get into the video, I just want to say this video is dedicated to Professor Yanni at Up Top Jiu Jitsu, my first Jiu Jitsu instructor and good friend. He's the one who has introduced this opening to me, and I just want to say I love you, I appreciate you, and I also want to let you know the next series that I'm doing after the Scotch Gambit is going to be on E4 C5, and we're going to do the Smith-Morey Gambit, so it's going to be a lot of fun. And without further ado, let's get into the video. What is up guys? Welcome to the Max Lange attack. This is going to be chapter 2 of the Scotch Gambit. So let's review a little bit of what we did in chapter 1. Everything we did was out of an E4, E5 position. And we always take our knight out to F3 and just attack this pawn. And just ask Black, how does he want to defend his pawn? Most people develop their knight to C6 and defend the pawn on E5 like this. Sometimes you will see D6, the Philidor's defense, or knight to F6, the Petrov defense. Today we're going to be looking at the most common response, knight to C6. We're just going to push our pawn to D4 and get a Scotch game. 90% of the time your opponent is going to take this pawn on D4. We could take this pawn back directly if we want to. This is the Scotch game, but we're going to go with the Scotch Gambit and go bishop to C4. Part 1 of chapter 1 was the bishop coming to B4, checking us right off the bat. We looked at these pawn trades with the bishop usually going back, castling, and now we looked at how we can set up an attack as Black gets this knight out and gets castled. In part 2 of chapter 1, we looked at bishop to C5. Black is essentially saying, if you're not going to take this pawn, I'm going to defend it. And then in part 3 of chapter 1, we looked at bishop to E7. Now for the Max Lange attack, we're going to revisit this bishop to B5 move. Let's say our opponent goes and defends this pawn, and we responded to this by castling. Now, Black has 2 minor pieces that he still needs to develop, so he'll either most likely play F6 on the next move, or he'll play D6 and get his light square bishop out. If our opponent plays D6, we're going to play C3 and go into the Haxo Gambit, which we looked at in a previous video. But now, instead of playing D6, our opponent plays knight to F6 immediately. This now brings us to the Max Lange attack, and we're going to respond to this position by playing E5. When our opponent played knight to F6, he was taking a risk. He's desperately trying to get castled, so he's throwing his knight out even though we can play E5 and attack it immediately. He could have played D6 to prevent this, but then we have lines in the Haxo Gambit. So now we've reached the Max Lange attack. Just know you can also get to this position by playing a regular Italian. And if your opponent plays the most common continuation, bishop to C5, the Gioco piano, we can just castle. And if our opponent now brings the knight out, we can now play D4 here. And if our opponent takes our pawn, we're right back in the same position. This is the starting position of the Max Lange attack. If we go back, there's one more way we can arrive at this position. Let's say we go E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6. We go into our Scotch Gambit, and our opponent brings the knight out first. And we castle. Here we're giving our opponent a chance to transpose, and we're in the same position. Obviously our opponent doesn't have to play bishop c5. They could instead take our pawn, but we'll look at this move in the next video. For now, our opponent plays bishop to c5, and now we're going to push e5. So our pawn on e5 is attacking this knight on f6. And the question is, where can this knight go? Right now it has 5 available squares that it could go to, but if Black plays knight to d5, it'll get taken immediately, so we can just take this option right off the board. What about if Black plays knight to e4? Here we can play either rook e1 or queen e2, lining up our heavy pieces at this undefended knight, and potentially pinning it to the king. I like to play queen e2 because if I ever do get this knight, I have more options to move around the center of the board. And I'm also defending my bishop on c4. Now notice that Black's knight in the center of the board is now completely trapped. It literally has no squares that it can move to without getting captured. So the only 2 options that Black has is either playing d5 or f5 and protecting the knight with a pawn. Let's look at d5 first. Whether Black plays d5 or f5, we're always just going to take this pawn en passant. This is going to get our pawn off the e-file, and now this knight is truly pinned to the king. Black has no time to castle in this position because we can straight up just take this knight. So our main plan from here is going to be to get our bishop to g5, and then get our knight to d2, attacking this pinned knight. Because we just took this d pawn, black is really only left with this f pawn to defend the knight. However, because he just pushed this d pawn, this bishop is now also free to come out and defend this knight. Let's look at if black defends with the pawn first. We can just continue on with our plan of playing bishop g5, attacking the queen. Black is most likely going to take our undefended pawn, and he probably won't play d7, getting in the way of his last piece from developing. And now we can continue on with our plan, playing knight b to d2. And now we have two attackers on this pinned piece, and now white's bishops are completely surrounding the squares next to the king. White's plan from here is just going to be to get his rooks to these open files, trade this knight off here, get the pawn back, and break through in the center. So now let's go back. If black defends with this bishop instead, we can still play bishop to g5. If black wants to take our pawn, then we can continue with the same plan of playing knight b to d2. Remember, black has no time to castle now because he'll lose a piece. And what's even better here is, let's say black, because he didn't push this pawn to f5, he now has this sneaky looking move, f6, protecting his queen and now attacking our bishop. What's funny is we don't even have to respond to this threat. We can still play knight b to d2, and if black wants to take our bishop, then we can just take this pinned knight and set up a ton of discoveries. Black has to take our knight, and we take back with the queen. We're going to start to either checkmate or win a ton of material in a position like this. So if we go back, just know that if black tries to come down to e4, we're going to play this nice move, queen e2, and then whether black plays d5 or f5, we're going to take en passant, get our bishop to g5, and get our knight from b1 to d2. So now let's look at f5. If our opponent plays f5, this is a much weaker move because it immediately opens up the diagonal for our bishop. So we take this pawn en passant, and black has no time to take back because he'll lose his knight. So after we take en passant, black has to play d5, hanging on to his knight. We can now take this pawn on g7, attacking the rook. Black really has no choice. He has to move the rook over. And we have a ton of winning options from here. We could just play knight b to d2 in a position like this, but we can also throw our knight into g5. When we put our knight on g5, we're setting up ideas for our queen to come to h5 and potentially set up checkmating ideas on f7. We're also thinking about trading off this knight, allowing our bishop to take this rook on g8. So now we can go back. And now we arrive back at the main position and we play e5. So we know that the knight can't go to d5, and we just looked at what happens when it goes to e4. But what about if the knight goes to g4? In this position, we're going to win our pawn back and also take away castling rights from black by playing bishop to f7. Black's only real response here is to take, and now we can play knight to g5. We check the king, and at the same time, we're attacking this knight. The king can't come forward, or else he's walking right into discoveries, so most likely the king will go back to g8. So we're going to play queen to g4 here. And now our opponent has a lot of options. He could play knight takes e5 with a tempo on our queen. He could play d6 or d5 with a tempo on our queen from the bishop. Or he can play an immediate h6, getting a tempo on our knight. Let's look at knight takes e5 first. Our pawn is just undefended in the center of the board, and black will get a tempo on our queen. But now we can put black into a tightrope moment where there's only one correct response to our move. We're going to play queen to e4 with the idea of sneaking into d5, checking the king, and then hopefully either trying to get some kind of checkmate on f7 or just attacking this bishop and attacking this knight. Black sees that both of his developed pieces, the knight and the bishop, are both undefended, and he can very conveniently defend them by playing d6, which also brings out his light square bishop. However, we have the very sneaky queen to d5 here, checking the king. There's no way to block this with a piece because it would just be checkmate, so the king has to move over to f8. The black king now lines up perfectly with our rook on f1, and now we can play f4, trying to take this knight on e5. Just know that when we play f4, obviously we're opening up this diagonal for our king, and our opponent can play d3, pushing his pawn and checking us at the same time. We can just move our king over, and there's no time to take this pawn and eventually queen because our threats are coming too quickly. Here we could just take on e5, and where can this king go? He can choose to sacrifice his bishops, he can sacrifice his queen, he can move his king out of the way. This is going to be checkmate, it doesn't matter. And now black's only move to stay in the game at this point is playing queen to f6, blocking the check, so that if we take this knight, we'll lose to a back rank checkmate. Now there's a great move here for white to hang on to the initiative and also attack black's queen. We're going to reference the previous video of the Benima defense when we go back to this concept of playing b4. b4 is just an awesome move here because there's no time for our opponent to take this pawn. We opened up the main diagonal for our bishop, and now we're pinning this knight to the queen. What's even better is we're only one move away now from connecting our rooks and ultimately making this queen super weak. Once our rooks are connected, we're free to take this knight, and this rook will be pinning this queen to the king. So we can go back from here. Okay, let's look at that one more time. So we entered the beginning of the Max Lange attack, and we played e5, attacking our opponent's knight. Black can't go to d5, and we saw what happens when he goes to e4. We play queen e2. But now we're looking at if he goes to g4. Knight to g4 is actually the most common move played on chess.com and Ally Chess from this position. We're going to sacrifice this bishop, and when black takes back, we're going to play knight to g5. The king has to retreat, and now we can finish off the trade. So there's four main moves that we're going to look at from this position. Knight takes e5, d6 or d5, or pawn to h6, attacking our knight. Right now, black's light squared bishop is tucked away, so the light squares are super weak. Also, our knight is ready to jump into these light squares. So our attack is going to be centered around getting our queen to this weak f7 square. The pathways can look like going to e4, then to d5, then to f7, going down to f3, then attacking f7 like that, maybe even coming over to b3 and checking the king here, and so on. Once we check the king, we can lead it over to the f file where it'll be right in line with our rook. Let's say black plays the most common move in this position, knight takes e5, attacking our queen. Black controls these two squares, so we can safely put our queen on e4. Now the most common move in this position, 66% of players play d6 and lose the game immediately to queen d5. We guide the king over to the f file, and now when we push f4, it comes with an attack on the knight. And now just be aware here that this knight cannot move at all. If the knight tries to retreat anywhere, let's say like g4, it had a very important job on f7. So essentially, the knight is cemented to this square until some other piece can defend the f7 square. Most likely, it's going to be the queen. 50% of players in this position have pushed the c-pawn and lost the game to pawn takes knight check. If the king moves over here, it's just an easy checkmate. Remember, black can always try d3 here. It's no real threat. We can just move the king over. And if black tries to make a queen, this attack is coming too quickly. It's going to be checkmate. So let's go back to this moment where we played queen e4. The second most popular move in this position is queen to f6, and this move loses immediately as well. We have that same tactic of attacking the f7 square by moving to d5. Obviously, the queen cannot block because the knight would take it. And if the king moves over, we just take this bishop. Let's say that the knight blocks this check. We can actually just trade off this knight and take the bishop now. So let's go back from here. So the best move for black is actually playing queen to e7, a really hard move to find, and we can play that same move targeting the f7 square. Remember, this knight can't come back because we can trade off pieces. So the king moves over, and now we have to be extra careful about playing f4. This might not be the best position now. Basically, because this queen now controls the f7 square, this knight is free to roam. So if we play f4, moves like knight to g4 start to look good for black. We can go back from here. So if black does find this move, play queen d5, and the king moves over. To continue our plan, we're just going to push this c-pawn and look to get our knight out to c3, just like we would with the Haxo Gambit. This bishop is going to try to come to f4, and we can move our rook to e1. So let's go back from here. Let's start with d6. When our opponent plays d6, we immediately notice that his bishop is attacking our queen. I really don't love the idea of pushing this pawn to block because of the move queen to f6. He's basically just loading up on this pawn, and eventually he's going to play h6, kicking our knight away. Our knight can't reliably protect this pawn, and essentially we overextended ourselves and we're going to lose the pawn. Same thing, obviously, he can just move his queen to e7 and attack our knight. If we try this plan, queen to e4 right now, he can take our pawn, and now we no longer have this entrance in with queen d5 because queen's protecting that square. If we take a diagonal back step with our queen to f3, we can threaten checkmate in 1 on f7. Also, by going to f3, we now open the door to go into the d5 square. So we play queen to f3, and now let's look at black's options. Black's most popular move here, played by 2/3 of players, is taking this pawn. This loses immediately to queen d5. We move the king over to the f-file, and we play this same move, f4. We don't care about exposing our king, we just move it over, and now we're attacking this knight. The only move to save the game is queen f6, and now what move do we play? b4. We attack this bishop. The bishop can either take or go back, and now we move our bishop out, and now the crosshairs are going directly at the queen. This is a game that we're going to win pretty easily. So black cannot take with this knight. And also just note, if black wants to defend this d5 square by taking the pawn, just remember that this is going to be checkmate in one move. So when we played queen f3, we set up this checkmate threat on f7. And we know that knight e5 is not going to protect that square because of queen d5. So we're essentially forcing the queen to come to the e-file in some way. Black can either go to e7 or e8. Now that we lured black to the e-file, we can open it up. Black can take with the bishop or the pawn. And now we're going to play bishop to d2, protecting the e1 square so that our rook can come out and attack this queen. We're going to try to lure this queen away from the f7 square and try to deliver checkmate with our queen. So we play queen to d2. Let's say black tries to kick our knight. We can now play rook to e1, attacking this queen. If black wants to continue protecting this square, he's going to play queen to d7. Now we can bring the queen to d5 or even b3 and check the king across the board. Obviously, black cannot block with the queen or our knight would take it. So we force the king over, and now our knight can jump in to the center of the board. No matter where the king goes, there's going to be some kind of discovery. For instance, if black goes to g8, we can just take on c7. So now let's go back. So we just looked at d6. Now let's look at d5. When black plays d5, the same threat happens. His bishop is now looking directly at our queen. And I still don't like the idea of pushing this pawn because black still has this thematic move of going to f6. And obviously we can't go here because it's protected by the pawn. But now what if we go to f3? When black played d5 here, this position is a little bit different than when black played d6 because now this queen is defending the pawn here. So when knight jumps in with knight e5 attacking our queen, we don't have this resource of playing queen d5 because it's protected by the queen. If we go back to when black played d6, it was fine for us to play queen to f3 because now when the knight goes to attack our queen, we do have this d5 resource. The king will have to move over and we can push f4. So d6 allows this attack, d5 does not. So black plays d5. We don't want to push this pawn. We don't want to move to e4 because the pawn defends it. And we don't want to play a move like queen f3 because knight e5 protects everything. So instead, we're going to play queen to g3. We're just going to protect our pawn. If we have to move our knight back, if it gets kicked, it can go to the f3 square. We can look to get our bishop onto f4, supporting our pawn. And we can look to push this pawn, getting our knight out in the Haxo Gambit style. That'll be our general attack. This rook can go to e1 and support the passed pawn. Black's king is cramping in his own rook. We can look to get some kind of attack going based on controlling the f7 square. The last move I want to look at in this position is if black plays h6 immediately, what we don't want to do is retreat this knight. Instead, we want to hammer in the concept of attacking on the light squares by going queen f3. Obviously, we're threatening checkmate, but black can easily stop this by taking the knight. The point wasn't to checkmate, but to go queen d5, checking the king as well as attacking this bishop. Black would be wise to go to h7, as if he goes to f8, we can just take this bishop with check. So black goes to h7, we take this bishop. Black will most likely play d6 here. Usually we would like to avoid trading queens here, but at the end of this queen trade, we will just be up a pawn, and black does have a horrible position. So we can go back from here. Yeah, so when you see your knight get kicked like this, try not to retreat. You always want to look for some kind of counter offense instead of immediately just retreating the knight back. If we do want to retreat the knight back, just keep black's counters in mind as well. It's smart to go to f3, but if we do go to e4, thinking we can attack this undefended bishop, to our surprise, black can play d5. Now he's attacking our knight and our queen at the same time. So we should be wary of these things when we have our queen out and we're attacking. We're always conscious of where this pawn's moving, because we know that it's this pawn is almost like a trigger that when it goes down, it's going to unleash the bullet on the next move, so to speak. Okay, that's enough of knight to g4. Now let's look at when the knight goes to h5. When the knight's on h5, we're going to do a similar thing. We're not going to take on f7 first. We're actually just going to play knight to g5, threatening to take on f7. If you're familiar with the fried liver attack, this is very similar. However, we have the added bonus that after we play knight to g5, we have a discovered attack on the knight on h5. Black can't even go back because our pawn defends that square. He can try to block our bishop's line of sight of the f7 pawn by playing d5, but we can just take this pawn en passant. He brings his knight back to safety, and now we can jump in and fork his pieces. We can also look at things that don't work, like if black tries to jump in with knight to e5, we can now just pick up this knight. Black obviously has no time to take our bishop because this is checkmate. So black might try kicking our queen first, but now we can sneak into the h6 square. Eventually we're going to sneak into g7, attacking the rook, forcing the rook to f8. So let's say black takes our bishop and now we sneak into the square, the rook retreats, and now we can throw in this move, rook to e1. He'll probably have to block with his bishop like this, and now we can set up smothered mate threats on the next move. Even if black tries to stop this by pushing the pawn, we can still get smothered mates. Black tries to defend another way, and we can checkmate this way too. So sometimes when you reach a position like this, black might just decide to castle, and you can pick up this knight, threatening checkmate. There's only one way to stop this, it's by pushing h6, and now we can go into some of those similar patterns that we've seen in the previous videos. So we're back in the starting position of the max Lange, and we push. So the knight can't go to d5. We saw what happens when it goes to e4 and g4, and then we just looked at what happens when it goes to h5. If it goes to h5, we play knight g5. Now let's look at the final knight move, knight back to g8. Although this move looks passive at first, it actually has a pretty good idea. Black wants to bring his knight out to h6, defending this f7 square. If we played a nothing move and black did this right now, we can destroy black's pawn center. However, we'll be playing knight d5 first. So now the bishop can't get to that h6 square. Now knight h6 seems like it starts to make sense. How can we take advantage of this move? Well, this looks super similar to the last position. We can play queen to h5. Now realize that in any of these positions, this knight taking on e5 may look like a good idea because it's attacking this bishop, defending this pawn, potentially getting ready to sack with check. But realistically, white is just going to play rook to e1, and now this knight is going to be pinned to the king. Black now can't castle, or they're going to lose their knight. This looks like a scary position for black, which explains why 70% of players castle in this position, desperately trying to get their king to safety. Here we have a great knight sack on h7, preparing to sack this bishop for this knight. However, we can't do it yet because the king defends this knight. How do we repel the king away? We play bishop to d3. The king goes back to h8, and now we can take with this bishop. If black takes our bishop, it's going to be a quick checkmate. Black instead raises the pawn, cutting off this light square bishop. We can just fall back. We have a huge, potentially game-ending discovery check coming, and we can pretty simply get our other pieces into the attack. So let's go back. Now if the king goes to g8, we're still going to take this knight, and when we trade off, we're going to be one move away from checkmate. What's cool here is if black tries to block with something like f5, note that we could take en passant if we wanted to keep this diagonal open, but we also have the option to take en passant this way if this pawn were to come up. So now we can move our bishop back to c4 and again target this king. And now notice how the escape squares for the king are completely cut off by this queen. Black tries to block with d5, and now we can take en passant here as well. Black can't block with this bishop either because he'll just lose it. And if he blocks with the rook, we can just play queen to g6. If the king moves over, this is checkmate. And if the king moves over the other way, we can take with the bishop, or we can take with the queen. We're going to win in a position like this. So we played e5, and we pretty much covered every single knight move, but the main move in this position played in 95% of Masters games is the critical d5. Now instead of moving the knight, black counterattacks our bishop in the center. We're always going to take this knight, and the only thing that black can do in this position is take our bishop. Now let's look at this position for a second. We could take this pawn, forcing black's rook to g8. However, we know at some point in the future, we want to play rook e1 and check the king. If we do check this king, black would not like to move over because then he can't castle. Black would like to castle because it gets his king out of the center of the board quickly, and it'll also help him develop this last piece, his rook. He's probably not worried about castling this way anymore because we can always take that possibility away by taking on g7. So when we play rook to e1, checking the king, black is most likely going to block with another piece instead of moving the king to the side. He can't move a pawn over to block, and he probably doesn't want to block with the queen. So he can only block with these three minor pieces. The light square bishop could come to e6, the dark square bishop could go to e7, and this knight could go to e7 or e5. However, right now our pawn is attacking this e7 square, making moves like knight to e7 or bishop to e7 kind of out of the question. Also, if we did go rook e1, black can't put his knight on e5 because then we can just take it. So if we move this rook over now, black's only option is to play bishop to e6 if he doesn't want to move the king over and lose castling rights. However, if we took this pawn, black moves his rook over, and now we check the king. Black has a couple more options in how he can defend. So we're going to play rook e1 first. Black is essentially forced here to block with the light square bishop because he'd lose a piece by blocking with any other piece. Let's do a little sideline here. If black does decide to play f8, we may be tempted to take this pawn with check, but black can now just take back, and it's not really clear how we're going to advance in the attack. So a much better way to go about this is to set up an attack behind this pawn. We're going to play bishop to g5, looking right at the queen. So now when we take this pawn, it's going to come with check, and then we can pick up the queen. Black is most likely going to take our pawn, and now we can put our bishop on h6, and we're going to push the king into this corner. See how our bishop and rook completely cut off this king? Our plan is going to revolve around getting the queen to the g7 square, or getting this knight to the f6 square. If we can accomplish either of those, we're probably going to get some kind of checkmate. So black plays bishop to e6, defending the check, and now we can take this pawn. We force the rook over to g8, and now we can play bishop to g5, attacking the queen. There are only two moves that work here for black, and it's playing queen to d7, or blocking on e7 with the dark square bishop. Obviously, we're attacking this queen right now, and it has to move. Black probably isn't going to go this way with the queen, so if he were to move, he would probably either go to d5, d6, or d7. If the queen goes to d5, we can play the super fun move knight to c3, attacking the queen. This pawn can't take because then we'll pick up the queen, and now our knight is making his way over to e4 and eventually to f6, where he can fork the king, the queen, and the rook. The only real safe square, but this is still losing for black, is by going to f5. We continue with our plan, trying to fork this rook. Black picks up our pawn and also tries to avoid the fork, and now we can trap black's queen with knight h4, and we should win the game from a position like this. Now let's see what happens when black goes to d6. We have to think about the journey of this knight, where when he goes to d2 and eventually to e4, he'll gain speed and essentially attacking power by attacking the queen on this square. In general, the closer our knight is to our enemy's queen, king, and rooks, the stronger it's going to be. I use the term close here kind of generally, but what I really mean is like key squares. We know that the knight is going to take this path to try to get to the king. As the knight makes this journey throughout the game, we have to look at its line of fire and potential attacking squares. For instance, when it's on e4, it's attacking these squares, but because we have this added check here, it's also attacking these squares. Essentially, your knight is super strong with this f6 check, and you should probably use it to win the game in these kinds of positions. Especially because your opponent doesn't have a g or an e pawn, it's going to make this square super hard to control. And because this pawn is too far ahead to guard this square, and black probably doesn't want to push this pawn, this e4 square is also going to be super hard to control. Black plays queen to d6, now we go bishop to d2, looking to attack the queen on the next move, and eventually go into f6. So black can really only play this queen here, or this bishop back. And also we know that knight to e7 is not going to work, because now that leaves this bishop undefended. And if we continue on our normal plan, we'll get a tempo on this bishop on e4, boosting us into this f6 square. So it's nice to know you don't even have to really remember all these lines. You can just remember the general plan of getting this bishop out and getting this knight out, and you can see why it works or doesn't work. So black can really only play this queen here or this bishop back. Let's look at the bishop going back first. We can just trade this piece off. Because he's given the chance to develop a new piece, black is most likely going to take with the queen. Also, he wants to keep his knight close to the center of the board. We see we're attacking this pawn twice, so we can take this pawn on d4. Black might be tempted to castle here now that he's finished development, but now we can take this knight, and black has no time to take our queen because we can take his queen with check. Black moves the king over to our knight. We take this rook with check. Black picks up our knight, and now we're just up a bunch of material. So if we go back, black has to play the only winning move in this position, rook to d8. Also, if you want to pause the video now, why can black not take this pawn? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Black takes this pawn. We have this super nice move, knight to f5. Forking the rook with check and the queen. If black takes our knight, now he's losing the queen. So black plays rook to d8, and now we have two moves that we can continue with from here. We can play c3, defending our knight, or we can play rook to e4, defending the knight. Also preparing to double up, but I like c3 better. I think it's more solid. And now the most popular move in this position is trading off knights, but if your opponent does decide to take this pawn now, which some people do, we can actually just go right into a 2 rooks versus queen endgame by taking this bishop. Obviously this rook can take our queen, and now we pick up the rook on g7. The king's going to move over to pick up our knight, and now we collect this rook. King takes knight, and now we can start to attack black's pawns, maybe jumping into b5 and attacking these pawns as well. We can move our rook over to b1 to defend b2, and maybe look for a draw in this position. This person knows way too much about the Max Lange attack. We should probably settle on a draw against this psychopath. So now let's cover when the queen goes to d7. So we can continue on with our knight plan of going from d2 to e4, and let's look at this position for a second. Black just got the initiative back, so he may think that he's in time to take this pawn. However, if he tries this, now we're going to e4, and now we're attacking this undefended bishop. Also, black obviously can't castle queenside because our bishop is preventing him from castling. Remember, you can't castle through check. Black also has to defend this check on f6, attacking his king and his queen, essentially winning the game. So the only move that black can play in this position, saving his bishop and preventing this check at the same time, is bringing his bishop back to e7. We can now trade this bishop off, and now when black takes back with the queen, we can now take this pawn again. We're essentially in the same position as we were before, but black has just taken this pawn, and now our knight has developed two squares to the center of the board. So let's go back to the main idea. Bishop takes on e7. So most of the time you're going to see black take with the queen so that he can still castle, but sometimes you'll see two sidelines, one sideline being the knight taking and the other sideline being the king taking. Let's look at the knight taking first. If knight takes on e7, the knight is no longer protecting this d4 pawn, so knight takes d4 starts to look like a great move. And now we can see we have a ton of pressure on this bishop that will probably fall on the next move. Black's best try here is kicking us away, and now we can jump in and take that bishop. Black cannot take back here because now we're going to swoop in with queen to h5, checking the king. We're essentially up a piece here. We're going to win this game. So black has to trade queens first. And now when we take back, black can take our piece, but black's pawn structure is completely destroyed and ours looks great. So now let's go back. Now let's look at when the king takes on e7. So now black has chosen to not castle, and he's bringing his king up into the center of the board where we have a rook and a queen. Now, why would he do this? He's doing this to protect his d4 pawn. He sees that his queen and his knight are protecting it, and our knight and our queen are attacking it. So to keep the balance of this pawn, he decides to take with the king. Now, how do we take advantage of this? We have to add one more attacker to this pawn while keeping this pin intact. How do we do this? We play to e4. Now we're keeping the pin and we're also attacking this pawn. If black does nothing here and just pushes a pawn on the side of the board, we'll start to trade off in the center, and now we're controlling the entire board. Black can try the in-between move, f5, attacking our rook, and we just have to know to go rook h4 instead of rook f4. If we go rook f4, then the queen can start to come down and harass our rook. Meanwhile, when we go to h4, we create another threat that black has to deal with, giving us time to throw this knight in. Black can really only take our pawn, defending his own pawn, and now we can throw this knight in, knight takes d4. Black would not like to trade off knights here because now we're going to be controlling the entire board. From here, black's best move is actually just to go back with the king. And now we can start getting into ideas like queen h5, starting to move in with our pieces and attack black's king. Alright, thank you guys for watching. That's the end of the Max Lange attack. We might do more lines in the Max Lange attack in the future. But the next thing that we're going to look at, so the thought process on how I did the chapters for the Scotch Gambit series is when they accept the Scotch Gambit and we play bishop to c4, chapter 1 was going to be when they brought the bishop out first. And then chapter 2 was going to be when they brought the knight out first. So ideally, if they bring the knight out first, we can castle and we can get into the Max Lange attack if they play bishop to c5. We should also include the idea of this knight taking our pawn, because black doesn't necessarily have to play this move defending his pawn. And in the next video, we'll look at how to deal with this position. So again, thanks to Professor Yanni for showing me that opening. It really made me love the Scotch Gambit, and it is essentially now my main weapon as white, so thank you, Professor Yanni. Shout out Dina Starita, huh? What's up, fool?